So to begin with, in terms of looking at politics, inequality, development, at the current time there's a real overlap in this. So Thomas Piketty's book coming out, in that he talks about the role of politics in determining wealth distributions. Adrian Lefwich talks about the shape of development being determined by politics in a country. At the same time, we've also had recent work by Andy Sumner and Alex Cobham that talks about this notion of this new bottom billion, that actually most of the world's poor now are living in middle-income countries. So the attention has to shift towards this notion of redistribution rather than just resource shortage. And this becomes really apparent when we think about countries like India. So this cartoon's from the late great, so he passed away last month, Indian cartoonist R.K. Lakshman. And we've got a situation where we have a country with a space program. At the same time, it's home to the majority of the world's poor. So this is a type of kind of inequality. We're talking about the kind of overlap of development, inequality, politics. It's very clear. At the moment, what we have is a situation, so we're talking about kind of bringing politics back in, but clearly politics is a very broad field, and politics has to a certain extent been brought back in, and the politics that has been brought back in at the moment tends to focus on explaining why we get this situation. So we have very good explanations for why you have a country like India where we have a government that's spending money on space programs, equally a lot of issues with regard to poverty. So a recent book by Amartya Sen and Jean Drez talks exactly about this issue. Most notably, so Duncan, again, stole my image. So Acemoglu and Robinson. The title is really important here. So it's Why Nations Fail. And we're starting to get very good, we have very good explanations of why nations fail, why we don't see change. So a real limit with the kind of institutional approach, which is very much seen as part of bringing this politics back in. While, again, it's offered lots of great explanations for why we see these differences, what it fails to tell us is how change occurs effectively. So heavy focus on kind of stability, institutional stability, this kind of long-term inequalities, these differences shaped by the rules of the game. But when it comes to explaining change, the emphasis then suddenly shifts to this notion of critical junctures, which is a very different type of critical juncture to what Shan was talking about. It's really this exogenous shock. How do we get from one situation to another? It's clearly something from outside the system that's got to affect this. So as Merrily Grindle has described with this institutional approach, there's a tendency to over-determine failure and under-explain change. However, and as Duncan's day in the British Library shows, you know, there are these cases where inequality has lowered, where change does take place, and there is a literature, there is a politics that actually starts shedding light on some of these examples, which I feel has kind of been lost along the way. So two books, and again, the titles are quite telling. So one is Despite the Odds, the other is Against the Odds, and it's this real notion that effectively this is very difficult. These structures are very, very stable, but we do see this change take place. So a few things that come out of this initial literature, and it's that, one, it's this notion of political will. So we have these explanations for why politics sees inequality, why we see these large levels of inequality. We have a lot of explanations, increasingly theories of what types of policies. So Professor Stewart talked about some of the types of policies that might bring inequality down. What's missing is effectively that in between. So how do we then get those policies implemented? And this is, and I wanted to avoid corny phrases, but the temptation's too good, but it's opening the black box of political will is effectively where this literature is going. It's why did some leaders decide to try and tackle this, and how did they manage to do this? So what comes out of it? A big starting point, which some of the kind of very dominant political approaches think about, is this notion of interests, incentives. It's incredibly useful to think about interest and incentives, but actually that's not where we're going to find change happens. Where change happens is actually people working against their interests, that people are complex, people in other countries, in developing countries, elites, often do want to bring about change. The issue isn't that their interests mean that they just want to accumulate wealth, it's that it's very difficult to bring about this change. So one of the things that comes out of these books, and a number of others like them, is it's political. It's finding these people that actually do have the commitment, and it's these coalitions of commitment. So we see, Shan's already kind of talked about this, leaders and coalitions, but very much insider and outsider leaders and coalitions. So Mary Lou Grindle's book on education reform in Latin America, what you see is inside government, you see a lot of kind of strong reform tendencies, but equally the ability to then bring people who have worked on education for years and years into government, even if it's temporarily, to be advisors. So you have this real mix of the types of coalitions you're bringing in, this social movements, it's people that have developed an expertise, it's teachers being brought into these circles. The politics of contention, again, it's been spoken about in the case of Brazil, it's how you deal with that contention. There is clearly going to be opposition, there's clearly going to be support, and one of the really interesting things is how that support and how that opposition is used, and so another book by William Asher, which I'd never previously come across until it was cited in one of these, from the 80s, and it talks about scheming for the poor, and it's effectively often this politics of contestation is best dealt with through not having this very confrontational approach. It's by being able to maneuver, it's by being able to build support, equally to distract opposition, to kind of put opposition at ease, rather than making it a very confrontational type of politics. He uses the term symbol manipulation. So one of the big things that's already come up is this role of narratives in society. So what are the general beliefs in society, and how can political leaders, how can reformists either play on those narratives or challenge those narratives? So one of the examples in the Against the Odds book is a chief minister in India, the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh, Digvijay Singh, and lots of poverty reduction strategies, lots of policies implemented. At no point during his speeches did he ever use the word poverty. Why? Because in India there's a long history of populist kind of politics really framed around this notion of poverty, so going back to Indira Gandhi. So instead he focused on this notion of development. Dare I say it, we're all in this together. And this was what really pushed through this agenda, and it kind of avoided that opposition. The other thing that comes into this literature is actually this kind of shift away from development as a very kind of specialized area to bringing back actually some of the stuff we know from political science. If we're looking at politics in developing countries, yes, there are going to be differences, but equally there's no reason why we wouldn't turn to some of the literature on the politics of policy reform, and this is what a lot of these works emphasize. So the role of agenda setting. How was inequality put onto the political agenda? Was inequality put onto the agenda, or was it a different issue, and inequality is a byproduct of that different issue? So poverty, Shan mentioned. How do you design reforms? What's the process of designing these reforms? How do we get these policies adopted? Again, a lot of this at the moment, and I'm probably talking to the wrong audience, but in a lot of the politics of development that takes place already, a lot of that gets missed. It's very much about elite settlements, political settlements, the role of elites in coalitions, which, again, very important, but so is the policy side of it, the politics of the policy process. Once these policies are adopted and implemented, how are they sustained? Often that's where you move from kind of central office, you then move to local office, to rural regions. How do you push these reforms through? So this is effectively where we've turned to, amongst other areas, but this is the literature that we've looked to particularly. So our focus with this project, very simply, is how have countries managed to successfully lower inequality? What were the policies, but beyond just the policies? So clearly the types of policies, the policy experimentation that we've heard about is important, but what was the politics that were brought into place? What about the longer term effects? Was this sustained, and if not, why not? When did it change? So in order to go about doing this, we've started with a two-step process. So the first is to identify these redistribution episodes. And the second is then to start to think about these politics of reform in terms of bringing about lower inequality. So step one, we've started, so Frederick Salt has this database, the Standardized World Income Inequality Database. So we started with a focus on the Gini coefficient, which is a very standard income inequality. It's vertical inequality. And we've used this as a starting point to then start to think about where these countries, where do we see these episodes of lowering inequality? So the data's there for 173 countries since 1960. Lots of imputation. So this isn't perfect data, but in terms of the purposes of identifying periods that we can then study, it serves a really, really important job. The idea came from Duncan, and he's already talked about the 5 cases he came up with. And so 4 of those we took forward. So the Bolivia, Brazil, Malaysia, and Mauritius case, just very broad research, just looking at some of the trends we see in these. And Shan obviously has done the Brazil case in real detail. So in terms of what we came up with, the episode, so this kind of mess of grass is what we've got, and this is our starting point for then trying to identify where inequality has gone down. So in the 4 cases, so the good thing about the SALT database is that we can build in the error functions given the data is not 100% accurate. So we can then start to identify, okay, when has inequality gone down? Step 2, examining the politics of reform. So as I've spoken about, we particularly turn to this literature on the politics of policy reform in development. And the framework effectively, it is very broad to begin with. It's what is the nature of inequality. Typically, as Professor Stewart's mentioned, it tends to be the horizontal inequality that's really key here. It's group-based inequality, whether that be class, race, gender features in this. Again, so our emphasis is on the role of agency, but that doesn't mean we then ignore the bigger kind of global or the domestic context in which these actors were able to bring about change. So these general global trends are really, really important in this as well. Redistribution instruments or policies of what were the specific policies that were implemented, often a broad mix, and we tend to only get ones, we tend to hear about the cash transfers. We don't necessarily hear about what happened with taxation or pensions at the same time. So a broad range of instruments often used. Really key is how inequality, and as I said, actually, was inequality put on the agenda, or was this part of a bigger political issue at the time? Role of political leadership in coalitions for redistribution, and implementation and sustained implementation of policy reforms. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the Bolivia case, especially given Shannon's already told us a lot about the Brazil case, and I think that really kind of demonstrates what we're trying to understand, what are the processes. But Bolivia, another really good example, very recent under kind of with President Evo Morales' election as president. What we see, high historic inequality, like a lot of Latin America. What's key is we tend to, again, we only tend to focus on part of the picture. So we tend to really focus on the role of social movements, which was absolutely crucial. What we don't see as much about is the role of electoral reforms in this process. So how these two things came together. So electoral reforms enabled power to be shifted. It's not just the main political parties that are now competing. It allows other groups to come in. At the same time, protests against kind of the 90s neoliberal policies. We see this big indigenous movement, and it's this mix of kind of social movement politics, of formal politics. And what's really interesting in the Bolivia case is actually it's the politics within that social movement. So MAS was very successful in bringing these movements together. Very often that's lost. So it's this politics of how you build coalitions outside of formal politics. So a range of, again, just the point, it's not a single policy. It's a range of different policies that we see. Global flows, other factors play a really important role. So oil and gas discoveries can't be the kind of role they played in being able to then fund these social programs in Bolivia, really, really important. So just then to sum up some of the key issues, political leadership, and by political leadership, we're not necessarily talking about the Prime Minister or the President. We're talking about local level political leadership. So a lot of stuff on the state level. So political leadership tends to be necessary but not sufficient in terms of bringing about these reducing inequality. Coalition building, not just formal coalition building. So clearly this is important, ensuring in Parliament that you're able to adopt these reforms, but much broader kind of notion of coalitions and different actors that are brought in, how you bring these different actors in. Again, going back to some of the kind of more standard political science, public administration literature. So again, you may have a political elite that really wants to push through reforms, but you've got a big bureaucracy, and how are you going to make sure that these reforms are passed? So this kind of political bureaucratic interface, different policies. Shan's already mentioned these kind of critical moments. So there's a literature, Paul Pearson calls it politics in time. Other people call it kind of complex confluence. It's this notion that we tend to think of the role of leadership, we tend to think of the particular policies, oil and gas discoveries. It's the fact that these things have come together at the same time, which often gets lost. Timing is very key. It's not a single cause, but how do you take advantage when things change? Tends to be really, really key. And finally, the last point in terms of what's come out of it, trade-offs and unintended consequences. So Professor Stewart mentioned the Malaysia case. It's a really good example. Race riots in 1969 leads to this new economic program, this new economic plan. What you've seen is affirmative action policies brought in. It's addressed a lot of the inequality issues, but has it affect in terms of long-term ethnic tensions? There's still serious problems in terms of how they've gone about doing this. The intergroup inequalities, so within the Malay ethnic group, huge inequalities emerging as a result of some of these policies. So the way forward, very briefly, for us is to get lots and lots of feedback, which hopefully over the course of today we will do and beyond. To start to think about these redistribution episodes and to identify cases, and then to really, what we'd love is for researchers and practitioners who are interested, who might have a particular country expertise or are interested in a particular country to then be working on these cases. And this is what we'd like to do, is build up a selection of these cases of how do we see inequality lowered. So thank you very much.